Hello, my name is Robin Smart, and I'm honored to be your host for this Learning About Dementia series. As the education coordinator for the Alzheimer's Society Guelph Wellington, I truly know the value of learning about dementia if you, a family member, or anyone you know is affected. This series wouldn't be possible without the generous funding of the Guelph Community Foundation. Their support has allowed us to bring this series to you, and the Alzheimer's Society is sincerely grateful to the Guelph Community Foundation. We also extend thanks to the Village of Arbor Trails, who allowed us a location and provided refreshments for each of the sessions. But the biggest thanks goes to you for watching this DVD. There are 6 DVDs in the series, and although they build on each other, each one is designed to stand alone as well. We encourage you to watch all 6 in the series, but you can jump ahead to a topic that is of particular interest or really pertinent to you in your situation right now. After watching the DVDs, we encourage you to be in touch with our office for further education opportunities or to talk to one of our social workers. This film considers changes that can be made in the environment and our interaction style that will really hone our ability to support people living with dementia. We briefly examine the PIECES system, which is a useful tool for examining what might be triggering behavior and thus gives us an idea of how we can eliminate it.
What we're going to talk about to start with is something called responsive behavior. And you might think that sounds a little jargony. You probably don't talk about responsive behavior every day around the dinner table. The reason we use that term responsive in responsive behavior is that we really want people to be aware and to understand that when somebody with a dementia acts out in some way or is exhibiting behavior that they certainly would not have been exhibiting in the past, that it is a response to something in the environment. It may be something in their internal environment, it may be something in the external environment, but it's always as a response. So that's why they call it responsive behavior. Now, I'm going to give you a quick test. I'm going to show you a slide for 5 seconds. Look at it any way you want. What did you folks see? You'll have to shout it out because I can't see hands with the lights down. A bunch of words. Did anybody count how many words? No. Do you want to guess how many were on this? About 10, 12? Okay. What do you think those words were about? You saw certain words, saw behavior. I certainly do not wish anybody to experience dementia. But we use that slide often when we're training or talking to volunteers or others to kind of mimic, in a way, what it's like for somebody with dementia who has to spend a lot of time sorting out what's going on around them. And so that's just maybe a minuscule flavor of what it's like. You see something, you know that somehow it probably goes together, but how do you make it make sense? Now, if I had given you longer, you probably would have looked at those words and started playing with them and put them in order to create a sentence. And the sentence you would have made eventually is, our brain determines how we experience the world around us. And it is truly only our brain that interprets and therefore determines the experience around us. So when we have a disease that causes changes in the brain or causes organic breakdown in the brain, then our experience of the world obviously is changed. And where does that lead us? It brings us to the point where people, sometimes when they go into long-term care, sometimes when they're in the community, start asking questions like, where am I? Why can't I go home? Where's my family? Who are these strangers? Why is that lady trying to take off my clothes? The person with dementia has a variety of losses in a variety of areas, and we talked about that in the first couple of lectures. So I'm just going to give you a mini review in case you weren't here week 1. if you have a dementia, then you have challenges with memory because you have memory loss, both short-term and long-term eventually, trouble with language, judgment, initiative. Your initiative disappears. You have trouble with your get up and go. You have a lot of trouble problem solving, sequencing things. What order do I do things in? And you have trouble navigating your environment because there are changes in your spatial visual abilities. So what happens is, with all those problems, sometimes people don't really recognize where they are in time or place, and they sometimes have trouble recognizing people. And there can be other things that are happening. They might have some confused thoughts, they might have some delusions, fixed ideas that aren't correct, or they may be misinterpreting what's happening in the environment. And all that means is that their reality has changed, and it can leave them feeling fearful or anxious, maybe even a little panicked. And if you're feeling fearful and anxious and panicked, what happens? Your behavior changes, and this is where we often see what we call responsive behavior. So if you have changes in your ability to think and process, that really means you're probably going to have changes that are quite out of character and maybe inappropriate to a situation in your behavior. So your ability to listen, process, and understand diminishes with dementia. The opportunities for you to get upset increase when you have dementia, and the end result is you see a lot of different behaviors. So here's a quote from Virginia Bell and David Troxell. They are dementia care gurus out of the States, and they wrote a whole series of books called The Best Friends Approach. If you ever want those books, we have them in our library. But they wrote, behaviors that we think are strange or unusual or upsetting are often the person's way of coping with a world that's real to him or her. So when somebody does a behavior that we think doesn't fit the situation, we're measuring it from our view of the world. And quite likely it really does fit the situation from the view of the world of the person with dementia. Now, in the past, we had all sorts of ways of describing people's behavior. We called it challenging or disruptive or inappropriate or difficult or problem. Those are pretty negative words, aren't they? Those are pretty thumbs down words. And what we came to realize through lived experience and through research is that people are truly only responding to what they are interpreting in the environment. And so when we say things like people are disruptive or inappropriate or difficult or challenging, it makes the problem their problem. We're kind of pointing a finger at them in a way. They are the problem. They're the challenge. They're the difficulty. And what we've done by calling it responsive behavior is recognizing that we need to figure out what they're responding to. And it puts the onus back on us to do a little detective work and problem solving. So when I'm talking about responsive behaviors, that big fancy term, what does it really mean? Well, what it really means is looking at things like agitation, where they're nervous and they're full of tension and distress. They're kind of unable to sit still and settle down. Aggression, they might be angry or loud or shaking their fists or pushing at people. Hallucinations are when you see or hear or smell or taste or feel something that isn't really there, but it seems very real to the person. Inappropriate behavior, they may be disinhibited. They're doing things that might not be socially acceptable. They might make a rude comment. The repetition. Repetition is something that I know is a challenge for many people. It's the same question over and over, or the same behavior over and over again. Other things that might be involved are rummaging, hoarding, hiding. I've heard people refer to this as collecting and shopping. People really have a tendency to take things and keep them close to themselves. They stockpile items, they put things in safe places, but then nobody can find the safe place, that sort of thing. Restlessness, this often occurs a little later in the day. Sometimes it's referred to as sundowning. Has anybody ever heard that terminology, sundowning? Sometimes people cope better earlier in the day, but as the day goes on, their ability to function does diminish. They feel like they need to be doing something. They need better lighting. They're kind of overworked, just figuring out their day and managing. They're very tired, and their frustration level is often higher at that time of day. Restless, suspicion, paranoia. They might feel people are stealing things from them or conspiring against them, or sometimes they even believe when it's not true that their partner is being unfaithful to them. Wandering, that's fairly obvious. That's the need or the desire to leave, to roam about, to move. And when we talk about a catastrophic reaction, that's when somebody's really overwhelmed by everything and they really seem to be almost a little bit out of control. It's things just build up and they overreact. So you might have a lot of tears, you might have a lot of anger, kind of an overreaction. So those are some of the examples that you might either be aware of or see in somebody. Now, Tom Kitwood is a very famous British scholar, and he really came up with the concept of personhood, where we value somebody no matter what their level of cognition. And he says when we're talking about so-called problem behavior, we need to view it primarily as attempts at communication. And that's really an important concept. So when we're looking at so-called problem behavior, should be viewed primarily as attempts at communication related to need. It's necessary to seek to understand the message and engage with the need that's not being met. So basically, it's unmet needs cause behavior. That's the short form. So we know that all behavior has meaning. People are doing things for a reason. Now, it may have to do with the disease process. Certainly we know that this is a progressive disease, that things change as time marches on, and our brains control everything we do. And when you notice behavioral changes in a person that has Alzheimer's or dementia, we need to really recognize that what we're seeing are symptoms of the disease process. Something is happening physically in the brain that results in emotional, physical, and psychological behavior changes. It really bears in mind to remember it's literally like having a broken brain. If you had a broken leg, people wouldn't expect you to run a marathon. If you have a break in the brain, people can't expect the same behavior as somebody had before. Trying not to take the behavior personally, much easier said than done, I recognize that, but it's really important to try to do that. The person doesn't have control over these changes, and they don't have a lot of say over what's happening to them, so try not to take it personally. When you're looking for the person behind the disease, remember that postcard we had last week, the blue postcard, and it says, "See me, not my disease"? Try to think of the person behind there. The person's still there as they once were. They have a lot of communication issues and functional issues, but the person is still there. And it's important to look for remaining strengths and abilities to build on instead of thinking of what people can't do anymore. Focusing on the positive. So changing behavior. We cannot expect the person with dementia to change. This is not a place where behavioral intervention is going to work for you. People will agree to something in the moment, but they can't retain the conversations. So we need to be aware of that. What you can do, though, is you can influence another's behavior. You can influence it, and you can control your own behavior. So these are the parameters that we truly have to work with. understanding behavior. So we've established that any sort of difficult behavior is often a sign of frustration and fear, or it's an unmet need, and it's truly a means of communication. The behavior is telling you, I'm unhappy, I'm scared, I don't like this, I don't want to do this, whatever. It's giving you some sort of message, and it is in response to something happening inside or outside of the person. So how do we become detectives? And we're going to look at something called pieces. And each of those letters stands for a different area that we need to look at. Because if we say to ourselves, oh, they have a brain disease and that's why they're doing that, and they're doing that because they have a brain disease, then we kind of get into circular thinking and we never investigate what we can do to change things to break that behavior cycle. So I'm going to give you these following 6 areas and examples of what to look for to make the changes. So let's talk about the physical first. Are the person's physical needs met? And what physical changes might the person be experiencing? Is it a possibility that they're hungry but they can't really tell that to you? Because if their processing isn't working right and they have a sensation and they have trouble identifying what that sensation is, does it mean I'm nauseated? Does it mean I'm hungry? Does it mean I'm constipated? Does it mean I need the bathroom? What does that really mean? And sometimes you're going to see behavior instead of words. So think about physical things. Could they need the toilet? Could they be in pain? Could they be hungry? Is it something they're too hot, too cold? Right now I'm melting of heat again. I'm sure you're all plenty warm today, just like I am. If I had dementia, I might not just say, okay, I'm really hot, I have to do this, I can take this for 2 hours, it's okay. I might act out in some way. I might be restless and irritated. I might take all my clothes off. I might respond in some way because I can't articulate what's going on, but I still feel it. Intellectual. Think about what changes in memory, reasoning, speech, language. What's happening in people when they go to problem solve? Their judgment is changing. What you might see here when they have troubles in the intellectual realm is those repetitive questions, the accusations of theft, difficulty recognizing objects and people, impulsive behavior, word-finding problems. So when this is happening for folks, you can appreciate what kind of a struggle they'd be having. Their processing speed is slowed. That's really what the first slide showed you. I just didn't give you enough time to sort it out. Well, life is like that for somebody with dementia. It takes them longer to process, and we think and move usually a bit too quickly. And as the dementia progresses, the front lobes of the brain are affected, and those front lobes maintain our filtering system. So when our filter system gets damaged, we're unable to filter out incoming stimuli. So everything comes in. That means noise, lights, action, color, movement, sound. Everything's coming in, and the person with dementia can't sort out for themselves what can I ignore and what should I focus on. So it's easily overwhelming to them. And people are less able to filter outgoing comments. We know that we should say something polite if somebody gets a new car or a new dress, or they show you their new baby. You're supposed to say something polite. But if your filter system is gone and you don't like the dress, or you think the kid is not attractive, or you think that they shouldn't have bought a gas-guzzling car, you're likely going to just say what's on your mind. And it might or might not upset folks. So be aware that when they do make an unfiltered comment, it has to do with the fact that they no longer recognize appropriate from inappropriate, and they truly can't appreciate the consequences of their remarks, how it makes you feel. So the front lobe of the brain is considered the supervisor, the CEO of the brain. And if you have damage in the front lobe of your brain, you're going to have trouble controlling your impulses. So if somebody had a box of chocolates and they hadn't offered it to you, you're not going to wait for the invitation. You're going to say, oh, that looks good, pop off the lid and start eating chocolates. well, me, if I were disinhibited, I would certainly do that. People might start swearing where they never swore before. That's really something that happens quite often. They might be more affectionate with strangers than they ever were in the past, and that might make people uncomfortable. And what happens is people can unfortunately get stuck where they either do things over and over, or they get stuck where they can't even start doing something. It's like your on-off switch either gets on or off, and it can go either way. And as I mentioned before, problem solving and planning takes a hit. When we think about the E in the word pieces, it stands for the emotional. And so what's the person feeling? We know that emotions remain intact throughout the disease process. If somebody has Alzheimer's disease, right up to the end, they can still feel emotion, but they have less control over those emotions. So people with dementia will react to our emotions and our nonverbal communication. That's really what they read. The words are secondary. The most important thing to prevent behaviors when somebody starts to act out is to acknowledge their feelings, to truly just hear them, to validate whatever emotion is pouring out of them, and try really hard to avoid correcting all the time. Do you remember the mug last week? It says, "I'm always right," and I begged you to let go of being right. This is really that concept again. Try not to be correcting unimportant errors. A quote from somebody who lives with dementia, who is traveling this journey, is that, "Maybe I don't know who stands before me, but I can recognize love and caring." Well, vice versa, maybe I don't know who stands in front of me, but I also recognize negative things pouring off you. So we really have to be aware and sensitive to our nonverbal communication. Maybe I don't know where I am, but I can recognize whether it's a safe place to be. And people can feel safe almost anywhere if the people around them are calm, confident, and safe. Capabilities, knowing the person's level of ability, because that's a constantly changing thing. People are able to do things for a long period, and then maybe there's a change in condition and their level of ability changes. So what you want to do to avoid a catastrophic reaction or a behavior situation is match the task to the person's level of ability, and to also be sure you match communication so that you aren't bombarding somebody with too much information, because that often leads to behaviors when we give them too much information all at once in a hurry. So we want to accommodate disabilities. The environment. Does that look like a pleasant environment? Not so much. What's important in environment is a happy medium. The more impaired the person, definitely the more the environment really influences their behavior. And so what we want in a dementia-friendly environment is an environment that's going to support the person to maintain independence. It can give the person cues to find their way around. It can offer adaptation in lighting, making sure there's adequate lighting, color contrast, and a balance of stimulation. Something interesting, but not too much clutter, too much visual noise, too much that it's overwhelming. So think about, when you're thinking environment, physically, what's in the room, what does it look like, and also think about what's happening in that environment. Is there a lot of noise? Is there a lot of rushing? They call the environment the silent partner in care. And the person with dementia doesn't have the ability to filter noise and stimulation as we do, so they're easily overwhelmed. We all have breaking points. The thing is, if you have a dementia, your breaking point tends to be at a different level than a healthy individual. People with dementia have less coping mechanisms, so you tend to see behaviors sooner. You want to keep your environment calm, quiet, comfortable and homey, well lit, stimulating without being over the top, and allow for movement. People really often with this disease have a real compulsion to be moving, to be having space to walk, space to move around. And what we don't want to do is make the environment into a catastrophic reaction chamber. Because when I talked about catastrophic reactions earlier, we need you to understand that reactions aren't willful behavior. When somebody really has a blow up, it results from usually a person-environment interaction where the margin is too great between our expectation of the person and their cognitive resources or their ability to deliver to that expectation. So we want to keep things well balanced in order to avoid any sort of overreaction. Because if not, somebody's going to come out crying or fighting. So the S in pieces has to do with social and cultural history. And I'm going to show you in the next talk a great book that you can use to really capture that for folks. And it's called the Personal Care Book, and I have it in the Caregiver talk this afternoon. So there's lots of causes of responsive behavior. We can be, and I'm going to look at 4 of them. It can be physical health. Unfortunately, having dementia does not protect you from getting other things. If you have a headache, if you have an infection, if you have a tooth decay, if you have mouth sores, if you have ulcers, if you have diabetes, any sort of other thing can also make the dementia worse and the behaviors worse. So we have to keep a good close eye on people's physical health in general. Then there's the complexity of tasks to think about. Are we asking somebody to do something that's just now beyond their level of ability? Or are we asking them to do too much of it at once? If we broke it down into several small steps and asked for one step at a time, would we be able to accomplish things? The other thing is the environment, and I've been talking about the environment, and changes in the brain. We know that this is a disease of progression, so we know that there will be changes as time goes on. And it's either any or all or a combination of those factors that lead to behavior. And that's why you need your detective hat on to think about what could be causing this behavior. So let's eliminate the trigger. Little word regarding coping mechanisms. Now, we all have breaking points, but healthy adults certainly have coping mechanisms. People with dementia have less of them, though, and that's why you see the challenging behavior. And this is where we do have some opportunity to change things. People might give responsive behavior for a variety of reasons. Could have to do with them, could have to do with the disease, could have to do with the complexity of tasks, and you'll see there's a star behind that one. Could have to do with their physical health, the environment, again that starred, and ourselves. We have control over, or we can adapt and change ourselves, the environment, and the way we're presenting things to folks, the complexity of what we're giving them. We have control in those areas, so we can help diminish by changing our approach, how often we see behavior. It's a row of dominoes there, and isn't everything joined to everything else? The way you respond to a behavior has an impact on the current and future responses of the person with dementia. If you can find out the cause of the behavior and then react in an appropriate way, you will not have this collapsing chain of dominoes. So the way that you respond does make a big difference. The way that you respond has an impact, and what you do immediately and the steps you take make a difference next time. So how do you decide what to do? And John Ruskin had a great quote. He said, "To be able to ask a question clearly is 2/3 of the way to getting it answered." So I'm going to hopefully help you figure out what to ask so you can get on your way to answering. And I'm going to suggest the ABCs of behavior. Now, A is a big word, stands for antecedent. In other words, what went on before. The B for behavior, what actually happened. And C, the consequence or the caregiver response. But that's big fancy terminology. You can carry before, during, and after in your thought process really easily. And that's all the questions are. What went on just before the behavior? What exactly was the behavior? And what happened after the behavior? So if you start taking note of before, during, and after, you will probably take yourself more than 2/3 of the way to solving the problem. So think about making some notes. If you're consistently seeing a behavior that's an issue for folks, think about looking at before, during, and after. If it's still a struggle, if you can't figure out what's happening, then consider community supports. There's actually a team called the BSO team, stands for Behavioral Support Ontario. They specialize in responsive behavior. So if you come see our counselors at the Alzheimer's Society and we brainstorm with you and you try some stuff and it doesn't diminish, then we can call in the BSO team. There are lots of agencies and programs out there that are designed specifically to assist with significant behavior. Might be through the Community Mental Health Association, might be through the Alzheimer's Society, might be through BSO, but there are assistances for you out there. And all you have to do is call us to make that appointment or email us to make that appointment. Get the appropriate referral. So here are a few caregiver tips. If you want to avoid seeing behavior, as much as possible, match instructions to abilities and match the tasks to the abilities. Be positive, calm, and friendly. Keep smiling through your frustration. Look for the reason behind the behavior. So you want to try not to overload folks with too many instructions at one time, and just go slow, a little at a time. Because sometimes when we get over expecting people to do certain things in a certain way and we amend how we approach it, how we bring it to folks, we're able to actually work more with some of their remaining strengths. And these are common remaining strengths. The awareness of memory and emotion, the ability to use their senses, all the physical senses, the ability to remember well-learned skills, whether it's playing the piano or playing cards. I had a gentleman in one of the homes where I worked who really couldn't do very much, but he was still a great euchre player. Boy, could he play cards. He could play euchre. And I asked him about it one day, and he looked at me with a certain amount of disgust and disdain and said, "'Cause I played euchre growing up all my life. I listened to euchre when I was a child." He said, "We didn't have babysitters. When my parents went out and played cards with the neighbors, they took the kids and the kids sat under the table, played at their feet, while the adults played cards. So of course I know how to play cards." Couldn't remember to do much else, but he could still play euchre. Something folks have done all their lives, maybe the music, maybe euchre, something like that, often remains. So think about the senses that, or the abilities that might be long ingrained. Long-term memory lasts a long time. Sense of humor often remains, and music appreciation. Music appreciation can last right to the very, very end of the disease process because music is housed in a different place than language. And so that's something that can be very valuable to folks. I'm going to encourage you to avoid confrontation. If you want to avoid a blow-up, a catastrophic reaction, then I would avoid confrontation. Try not to argue and reason. People's ability to follow logic and rational thought process is definitely damaged. When someone is confused or agitated, try hard to diffuse the situation by validating feelings. They may be angry, they may be confused, they may be suspicious. Just hear them. You can offer to help search for lost items. It's still a frustration to them, whether they lost it themselves or hid it, put it somewhere very safe and can't find it now. Just offer to help look. Try really hard to avoid reality orientation, where you just say, "No, you're wrong, this is the way it is." I would try not to go there. You can gently guide to another topic. Using distraction, and again, I encourage you, if at all possible, change your location as well as your topic when you're going to distraction. And I would say honor their personal space. When somebody's really wound up and they're exhibiting a lot of tension and anger and agitation, I wouldn't get in too close. I would hear them, but I would hear them from a little bit of a distance. I wouldn't be right on top of them, patting them or trying to hold them in that moment. I think they need to have their personal space and express what they're feeling before we get too physically intimate with them. So what can you do? Back to the validation therapy, where you just meet them where they're at, hear them, talk to them about what they want to talk about, and don't try to insist they see the world the way you see it in a given moment. You really want to listen to the emotional content of what they're saying. The words are secondary to the emotion of what's coming off them. So if the person with Alzheimer's disease seems confused or agitated, you want to validate their feelings. It's always supporting the meaning behind the words. You don't have to agree or disagree with them. You just have to let the person talk about the issue and then move on. It's really that you don't stick with the factual, known reality. You hear where they're at, join them on their journey. It's all about connection, not correction. So you do that by slowing down, by being patient, by trying to be realistic about what they can and can't do. Learn what you can about the disease. So I encourage you to keep coming to education lectures or take some of the books out of our libraries, or we have a variety of different movies and DVDs you can borrow, and let go of being right. When you look at the needs on the screen right now, I don't think there's any that you'd stroke off the list. These are all things we need. We need respect, emotional closeness, autonomy, to be valued, dignity, and holistic care. The only thing is, if we want to avoid responsive behaviors, we have to add a couple of things to the list for somebody with dementia. They're also going to need an adapted environment, adapted tasks and communication techniques, and definitely educated caregivers. So pat yourself on the backs for coming out to this lecture series. And remember, the person cannot help their behavior. It's caused by an organic brain disease, so we have to change ourselves and the environment. Very famous man we all know, Sir Winston Churchill. To look is one thing, to see what you look at is another, to learn from what you understand is something else, but to act on what you learn is really what matters. And I'm inviting you to learn everything you can when you see a behavior in a family member, and then act on what you learn. Change the way of approach, change the communication, change the task, change the environment. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, we're going to bring the lights back up now. We're going to take questions and comments. You can always contact us for our free services. And once again, all this information is on the back of the brochures, the handouts that you have today.